What's up, guys? Nick Whalen here from RotoWire, talking some fantasy basketball, talking trade deadline. We are 3 weeks out from the deadline, February 6th. So I'm going to give you 4 players that I would consider trading away before that deadline. Try to cash in while the value is at its highest. Before we get into the list, as always, please make sure you're subscribed to the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball channel. Please give us a like if you're enjoying these videos. Let's get right to it. All right, I'm going to start with 2 players. We're going to break the rules right off the bat. We're going to the Chicago Bulls. We have to talk about Zach Lavine and Nikola Vucevic. I think these two are kind of linked at the hip as the deadline approaches. So the Bulls are right where they always are, right? Hovered a few games under 500. Could probably make a push for the play-in if they really want, but obviously not good enough to win anything of real consequence. So hopefully the Bulls finally realize that. I think this is the year. I would like to think it's the year that this finally happens. We'll start with Vucevic. He's 34. His contract is up after next season. Plenty of teams around the NBA are in need of a productive big man. The issue is just about anywhere Nikola Vucevic lands, wherever you want to pencil him in, he's not going to be featured in the same way that he has been in Chicago these last couple of years, and especially this season when he's had the best and most efficient year of his career. I mean, he's still shooting well above 42% from 3 on the season. It's possible he could walk into a starting role for another team. You know, others might prefer him as kind of an overqualified bench player. You think of a team like the Knicks, for instance, who would love to get their hands on Vucevic. They need another big man behind Karl Anthony Towns. But either way, he's likely going to a better team, a better basketball situation, but not a better fantasy situation. So if you can get off of Nikola Vucevic, who's been, borderline first-round guy so far, I think now might be the time to do it. Same goes for Zach Lavine, who's also played really well this season, and most importantly, has not missed much time coming off of a couple of injury-riddled years. He's more of a featured scoring option, a little bit more translatable, I think, to just about any team, perhaps more than Vucevic is. He's younger, so you could see, other teams kind of falling in love with that profile. But again, he's unlikely to land somewhere where he's walking into a 27% usage rate and close to 25 points per game, which he's given the Bulls right now. So both of these players will still be viable fantasy options. They'll still be valuable, even if they are traded. I'm not saying get rid of them at all costs, but if you need to shake things up, if you're trying to make a run in your league, getting out ahead of a potential trade like this, or maybe even a possible late season shutdown if they're not traded, this is the way to do that. So if we do see Vucevic and or Lavine dealt, I think any of Jalen Smith, Ayo Dosunmu, Montas Buzelis, maybe even Kobe White, those guys would all be in position to benefit. You have to keep in mind, though, that in any deal involving a high salary player, I mean, Chicago's going to be bringing guys back. So it's possible they could get a guy or two who would end up stealing quite a few minutes in that rotation. But we'd likely be looking at Kobe White taking over as the number 1 option. And as of right now, Jalen Smith is really the only other viable big man on that roster. All right, next up on the list, I want to talk about Cam Johnson of the Brooklyn Nets, at least for now. The Nets may be the most obvious seller right now in the NBA. And Johnson, to me, is the most likely of those Brooklyn Nets to be traded by a pretty good margin. If you look at the sports books, they're actually offering Cam Johnson next team odds, and the Nets, his current team, his current employer, are the 4th most likely team to retain his services after the trade deadline. You look at OKC, I think that would be the obvious fit. They have the firepower to make a deal like this and kind of trump any other offer. Indiana, Sacramento, Memphis, Denver, Houston, the Lakers. I mean, all these teams covet what Cam Johnson brings to the table. He's in the midst of the best statistical season of his career. 20 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists, over 3 3-pointers per game, excellent shooting splits. But he's been a featured option in Brooklyn, which you couldn't really say in years past. I mean, Cam Thomas, among others, has missed a bunch of time. That's led to Johnson posting a career-high usage rate. Like every player on this list, he'll still be plenty productive in a new situation, but if he lands in OKC, for instance, he's suddenly the 4th option once Chet Holmgren is back in the mix. So he's been a borderline top 50 guy on the year. I would try to cash in on that now while I can. All right, Colin Sexton of the Utah Jazz. Sexton has also had a great year so far, all things considered. Jazz are in the tank. Virtually every key player other than Colin Sexton has missed a ton of time over this first half of the season. He did just miss his first game of the year this past week, sat out for rest purposes on Wednesday, which is a little concerning long-term, that the Jazz, want to ensure that they take a loss and hand the Hornets a win in that game. Sexton himself just actually missed his first game of the year this past week, sat out for rest purposes on Wednesday, which, if he does remain on this roster, a little bit concerning from a shutdown perspective. It's not a coincidence that the Jazz were looking to take a loss specifically against the Hornets, a team that will likely be in that bottom 4 contention when it comes to draft positioning in 2025. But we'll put that aside for now. We'll focus on the possibility of Sexton being traded. Now, he's not on an expiring deal, but his contract is team friendly. He's off the books after next season. So I think he's going to have plenty of appeal in the trade market. Sexton's 26 years old, so not old necessarily, but by Utah Jazz standards, maybe a little too old. They're nowhere near contention. They're clearly in the Cooper Flag sweepstakes this year. There's a pretty good chance in my mind that they'll be in the same spot again next year. So we're looking at a long-term 2, 3, 4-year rebuild here. Hanging on to Sexton beyond this current contract to me doesn't make a ton of sense. Plenty of teams would love to have Colin Sexton, but many of those would probably view him as a sixth man. Somebody would have a tough time maintaining his current numbers. He ranks second on the Jazz right now in usage rate behind only Jordan Clarkson, obviously. With the amount of time that guys like Clarkson, Markkanen, Collins have missed this year, Sexton has basically been operating as the number one option for about half the year. There's a lot of nights where he's clearly the number one guy out there. Now, you look at teams like Atlanta, New York, Orlando, Indy, Detroit, Houston, the list goes on. Much like Cam Johnson, all these teams would love to add Colin Sexton to their rotation. But again, the trade-off is a better basketball situation for what would have to be a reduced role by default. Sexton is another guy I would try to cash in now while he's a top 75 player. I think the chances that happens, if he's not in Utah after the trade deadline, pretty slim. All right, we'll finish out with the fourth and final player on our list, Jakob Poeltl of the Toronto Raptors. So of all the players we've mentioned, Poeltl to me might be the least likely to be traded, but I still think there's a pretty reasonable chance. His current contract takes him through 2026-27. That's on a player option, but he's making under 20 mil a year, so it's not an albatross contract by any means. He's only 29, which is kind of surprising. Feels like he's been around way longer than that, but the Raptors aren't close to contending. He doesn't necessarily fit their timeline at this point. If you sell now, I think you could get some real assets for Poeltl in fantasy. He's been a top 50 player so far in total value. He's only missed 5 games on the year. Gives you rebounding, efficient scoring, a few assists, blocks, steals. He's over 1 per game in both of those categories. It's all there. He's been a great fantasy player, but he's also playing 6 more minutes per game than he was in each of the previous 2 seasons. He's up close to 32, 33 minutes for most of his career. He's kind of been this 25, 26 minute guy, and that's probably the peak. So if he does get traded, you're probably looking at closer to his 2022-23 production at best, which is still very good, still borderline top 100, still worth rostering, of course, but nothing like what we've seen from him over the first half. This has been easily the best 35-game stretch of his career in terms of fantasy production. So with Poeltl, it's really a combination of, you're probably looking to sell high regardless. The chances of him keeping this up over the course of the entire year, in my mind, not great. And you're also insulating yourself in the possibility of a trade. Again, it's not 100%. I think some of the other guys on this list are much more likely to be dealt. But if the Raptors do make a move, if they're going to sell off any pieces, I think Poeltl would have to be the guy. So I'd be looking to get ahead of that if I can. All right, those are the players to monitor now that we are just a few weeks out from the NBA trade deadline. Let us know in the comments what you think. Any other players you're worried about, feel free to chime in on our podcast as well. We do those live, and you can find them archived on the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball YouTube channel. Always like getting comments, reading those on the show and getting feedback. Again, make sure you're subscribed to the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball channel. And go to rotowire.com/try, TRY. That'll get you free access to everything on our site, rotowire.com/try.